Hello, writers. So, point of view. In Shakespeare's play The Tempest, there's a scene toward the end. If you know the play, you know the setup. There's this wizard sorcerer guy, Prospero, who is exiled on an island, and with him is his daughter Miranda, who's, maybe 14, 15, 16. And toward the end of the play, a ship arrives with a bunch of sailors on it, young men. And here's how Miranda reacts to their arrival. Oh, wonder! How many goodly creatures are there here! How beauteous mankind is! Oh, brave new world that has such people in it. And here's how her grumpy old dad, Prospero, reacts to the same sight. "'Tis new to thee. 'Tis new to thee." And that's point of view. Everybody sees and experiences the world in a way particular to their own experiences, their own history, their own understandings. That's something that we keep in mind when we write fiction, that our characters and their experience of the world is often the lens through which we are telling the story. And that lens really defines how the story is told. For example, I was writing a third-person story once, and a mentor read it and said, "Who is telling the story?" And I said, "Well, no one's telling the story. It's in third person." And he said, "Someone is always telling the story." Okay, so I had to think about that, and what I came away with is that, not every third-person story is told with exactly the same third-person voice. Even third-person narrators have a personality, have a stance toward the material, toward the story, that's shown by tone. Even third-person narrators have to choose a kind of language in which to tell the story. Just because you're writing in third person doesn't absolve you of having to think about who's telling this story and even why. And Rust Hill said that every story has an author and a reader. And the question of how the story goes from one to the other is at the heart of point of view. How the story goes from the author to the reader is at the heart of point of view. And if you think about it, what it really means is there are like three parts to the equation. Think about it. You, the author, are not actually telling the story to the reader. The reader is reading a story narrated by someone who is actually not you. So the point of view and consideration of point of view is essential to how your story gets to the reader. One way to think of point of view is to think then about who's telling this story. Who is the storyteller? And there are certain factors that you consider, not just first and third person, that help you understand who is telling the story. Proximity. How close is the voice to the story in time and place? Is it telling it years later Is it telling it from another land? Intimacy. How close is the storyteller to the characters? Does the voice know the character's deepest thoughts? Does it even know things about themselves that they don't know? Does it know what's going on in their subconscious, even in a way that they're not fully aware of? Scope of knowledge. So there's a famous example of this. Gabriel Garcia Marquez, in his novel 100 Years of Solitude, is omniscient in a way. His novel is written from an omniscient point of view. But the narrator knows everything only about this little town of Macondo, this little village where the story takes place. The narrative voice is not omniscient about the whole world, just about Macondo. So the scope of the knowledge is limited. The attitude of the voice to the story and the characters. A little sardonic? Is it a little sarcastic? Is it kind? Is it generous? What sort of language is the storytelling voice going to use to describe the story? A highfalutin language, a common language, a language that's associated with one of the characters, or something else. And if you look at the PowerPoint, you'll see some examples of how the same writer, writing in third person, two different stories or novels, can give you two very different points of view and two different feelings based on the point of view. Now, the thing is, very few writers make a conscious decision, I'm going to write this in first person, or I'm going to write this in third person. The stories tend to just come to them with a voice, with a narrator. And sometimes that narrator is third person and sometimes it's first person. Some writers just feel stronger in one of those points of view and so often write in them. A writer like Junot Diaz has never written anything in third person. And there's a writer named Robert Stone who once said he just felt stronger in third, so he never wrote anything in first. So what's important is not choosing a particular point of view for your story. Let the point of view choose you. What is important is knowing how to use the point of view that's chosen you. So, first person. In reality, every first-person narrator is unreliable. Because every first-person narrator is only telling you the experience and the truth that that person knows. Even if that person is earnest and sincere, that doesn't mean that person is right. And it's important to remember that when you're writing your character. Is your character really working to tell the truth of a situation? Is your character trying to make him or herself look better? I mean, to know that this is true, all you have to do is consider social media. The way people curate their own posts, the way they put their best look forward. Well, narrators and stories can do that too. Think about some of our own first-person narrators whom we've met this semester. How about the fella from Cask of Amontillado? How reliable is he? Isn't he pretending the whole time that he was right to kill the man who insulted him? But at the end, he can't help himself. He lets us know that this has troubled him for a long, 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 long time. And the guy in emergency, how reliable is he? How much can you believe of what he's telling you? Not much. But is he sincere? Is he earnest? Is he trying to tell you the truth? He is. He is. All you have to do is read that last paragraph, that paragraph toward the end. What's important for me to remember, he said, is that early the next morning the snow was melted off the windshield and the daylight woke me up. A mist covered everything, and with the sunshine was beginning to grow sharp and strange. The bunnies weren't a problem yet, or they'd already been a problem and were already forgotten. And there was nothing on my mind. I felt the beauty of the morning. I could understand how a drowning man might suddenly feel a deep thirst being quenched, or how the slave might become a friend to his master. Georgie slept with his face right on the steering wheel. So even if your character is unreliable, even if your narrator is unreliable, that person is telling the story for a reason. And in first person, you have to have the sense that the story is urgent in the narrator, that the first person narrator really needs to tell that tale, is almost in fact desperate to tell that tale. It's really something, Bob says at the end of Cathedral, because he has to tell you about this time the blind man came, and they drew a cathedral together, and it changed his life. Second, about a first-person narrator. Generally, you want those people to have really interesting voices. There are writers who will say, if you're not going to give your first-person narrator an interesting voice, just tell it in third. How about that story you're reading this week, My Friend Lucy Who Smells Like Corn? My Lucy Friend Who Smells Like Corn. I mean, right there, right? I just said the title wrong. It's much more interesting that she says my Lucy friend, not my friend Lucy. If a character doesn't say things in interesting ways, you're not taking full advantage of your first person narrator. Second person, the you point of view. We haven't read any stories in second person, and there's a reason for that. There aren't that many. It's not a point of view that works very well or works very easily. And none of you wrote your stories in second person, so we're just going to skip that for now. Third person is wonderful. Third person might be my favorite point of view because I find that it offers so much range. You can tell a third person story in any number of ways. Generally, writers will talk about third person voices falling along a spectrum. And that spectrum runs from close third person, where the narrative voice is right up there inside the character. Might even know more about the character than the character knows about him or herself. Think about Bullet in the Brain, which we're reading this week. That point of view not only knows what the character is remembering as he dies, it knows what he's not remembering as he dies. I mean, that's a pretty significantly close point of view. And then, of course, we end up with a more distant point of view sometimes. A point of view that just watches the characters, that doesn't get inside their heads, that is almost cinematic. It's almost like a film. I mean, a third person can be as all-knowing as omniscient, right? There are omniscient points of view. They know everything that's going on in the world. And then they can be as tight as third person studying the interior consciousness and subconsciousness of only one character, of Anders in Bullet in the Brain. And third person can also determine language, right? If you're really close to your character in third person, you can use that character's language to tell the story. So how does that work? How a third person point of view can still use the character's language? It works in a few ways. Here's one. This is the opening line to Bullet in the Brain, which you're reading this week. The line was endless. Tobias Wolff could have written, the line was long. Tobias Wolff could have written, the line had 24 people in it. Tobias Wolff could have written about the time Anders had stood in line. But he said the line was endless. Because that's how Anders sees the line. It's endless. It's not just long. That's language taking on the character's point of view, even in third person. I'd also like to point out this small thing. It doesn't have to do with point of view necessarily. The version of the story you read, Bullet in the Brain, is what was published in the New Yorker magazine when the New Yorker published the story for the first time. Later, Tobias Wolff included it in a short story collection he published, and he changed the opening line. And this is how he changed the opening line. So, of course, the line was endless. Think about that in terms of point of view. Now here's a warning. If you just switch point of view arbitrarily in a story, you go from first to third, you go from this person's consciousness to that person's consciousness, and it's all arbitrary. It's just like for your own convenience or your own interest. Your reader is going to get really annoyed. Your reader's going to get confused. Point of view needs to have a consistency to it, because it is that way that the story gets from the author to the reader. So you need that to make sense. The easiest way is to choose a point of view at the beginning and stick with it. If you're going to change point of view in the midst of your story, you have to take the reader into account. You have to prepare the reader. You have to give the reader an understanding of your own story. You have to, in a sense, teach the reader to read your story. This is not easy to do, and so I don't recommend it right now. This is an early story, early in your career as a writer. Keep it simple. Choose your point of view. Stick to it. If you're in first, remember, create a really interesting language, a really interesting voice for your first person narrator. And think about your narrator's personality. Is your narrator reliable or unreliable? Is your narrator unreliable in a way that is cagey and dodgy? Or is your narrator unreliable because of their mental state, their sobriety? Or is your narrator unreliable but so earnest and trying so hard to tell the truth? And if you're in third, well, what language are you going to use for your third person voice? Is it a language close to the character? Is it something more distant, a kind of fairy tale once upon a time language? Why? What are the advantages to each? Do you want a more distant tone? Do you want to get closer to your character? Do you want to be inside your character's head, thoughts and feelings? Do you want to back off a little bit? All of these are legitimate, but they all have effects. And it's good to think about those effects as you're writing your story.